All right, so you think you know the story of Julius Caesar's assassination, right? I mean, it's pretty much a cornerstone of English literature. But what if the play that basically cemented that story in all our minds is not quite what it seems? Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're doing something really cool. We're going deep, really deep into some fascinating annotations from an 1883 edition of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.
We're going way beyond just plot summaries here. Think of these as historical reflections, kind of looking at the play's origins, the sources that Shakespeare might have used, and how he brought these larger-than-life characters to life on the stage.
Yeah, exactly. Consider this your shortcut to becoming a Julius Caesar whiz, basically. If you've ever wondered how history gets woven into literature, why some stories capture our imaginations for centuries, stick around. Well, this deep dive is for you.
It is. Doesn't matter if you're a Shakespeare scholar or if this is your first foray into his work.
Yeah.
We're aiming to unpack these insights in a way that everyone can grasp, without getting bogged down in all that super academic jargon.
Exactly. So our mission today is simple. We're peeling back the layers of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, using these 19th century perspectives as our guide. We'll tackle questions like, did someone else have a hand in writing this thing? How accurate is it historically, really? And what is it about Shakespeare's characters that keeps us so fascinated, even after all these years?
Let's dive right in, shall we? I think a good place to start is with the text itself, the actual physical book. It's remarkable that the 1623 folio edition of Julius Caesar is considered to be in such good shape, textually speaking.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, it is. You see, that 1623 folio, it's the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. So it's conditioned, it's a big deal for scholars and stuff. The notes we're looking at say that there haven't been that many passages that editors have really struggled with over the years. It seems like that original printing was pretty solid.
So you'd think that would be it, right? Case closed on the text. But hold on. This is where things take a fascinating turn. Back in 1876, a Reverend Flea made a pretty bold claim. He thought that the play as we know it might actually be a shortened or altered version of what Shakespeare originally wrote.
And get this, the person he suspected of doing the altering, Ben Jonson. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare, also a pretty big deal in the playwright world.
Oh, wow. So another playwright messing with Shakespeare's work. That's kind of a big deal. What made this Flea guy think that, though?
Well, he had some interesting points. He pointed out that Jonson was known for revising and adapting other writers' works. That wasn't really a secret. He also noticed all these short, kind of broken lines in Julius Caesar, way more than usual for Shakespeare. But the really intriguing stuff is the specific words and phrases that pop up in Julius Caesar, but are totally absent from all of Shakespeare's other plays.
Like what?
Oh, like quality and kind, bear me hard, chew upon this, those sorts of things.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, and guess what? Those phrases, or ones very similar, show up in Jonson's plays.
So it's like a linguistic fingerprint, almost.
That's a great way to put it. But it gets even more specific. Flea found this passage in Act 3, Scene 1, a pivotal moment in the play, and he suggested that Jonson likely reworked it.
And why would he think that?
Because that particular passage, at least the ideas in it, seems to echo something from Jonson's own book, Discoveries, which was published in 1637, well after Shakespeare had died.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about what was going on behind the scenes in Elizabethan theater, how these texts were maybe more fluid than we think.
Yeah, it does make you wonder, right? So even the stuff we consider literary canon might have these hidden layers of collaboration or revision. That definitely changes how we see authorship and the whole idea of individual genius, especially back then.
For sure. It highlights that theater was more of a collaborative effort in those days. And while the notes do say this is still debated among scholars, it adds this whole layer of mystery to a play we assume is pure Shakespeare.
Okay, so from who wrote it, let's move on to when it was written.
Right.
The notes talk about a lot of uncertainty around the exact date Julius Caesar was written. Some scholars say it was during the middle of Shakespeare's career, others think later.
Yeah, for the longest time, there weren't any clear contemporary references to the play that could settle the debate.
But then there's this really big clue that pops up in another one of Shakespeare's masterpieces, Hamlet.
Right.
You know Hamlet was being written around 1602. In Act 3, there's that famous line from Polonius, "I did enact Julius Caesar. I was killed in the Capitol. Brutus killed me."
Right, a key line. See, our Julius Caesar also has the assassination happening in the Capitol. So that means that some version of the story, maybe even the play we know, must have existed by 1602.
Interesting. And to add to that, the notes remind us that Shakespeare wasn't the first one to bring the Caesar story to the stage. There was even a Latin play on Caesar performed at Oxford back in 1582.
That's right. So this whole historical drama thing was already a thing. There were a few other attempts to pin down the date, too.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, a scholar named Mr. Collier argued for a date before 1603. He based this on some similar lines he found in two poems by Michael Drayton, one from 1596 called Mortemeriados, and another from 1603 called The Barons' Wars.
So he thought Shakespeare might have borrowed from Drayton.
Yeah, but the notes offer a counterpoint to that. They suggest that the language Collier focused on might have been pretty common in poetry at the time, so the similarities might not mean a direct influence or anything.
Right.
But then we get what seems like a more concrete clue. The notes point to a quote from John Weaver's Mirror of Martyrs. This was published in 1601, and it seems to directly reference Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. It feels like pretty strong evidence that the play was around by then.
Okay, so that's 1 point for 1601, but then the notes throw us another curveball. They bring up this whole idea of stylistic analysis, which is basically looking at things like Shakespeare's sentence structure, the words he uses, and the themes he returns to.
Right, because his style evolved over his career.
Exactly. And the argument here is that Julius Caesar is missing some stylistic features that are really obvious in his later plays, like The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, Coriolanus, and Cymbeline. This raises the possibility that Julius Caesar might actually be from earlier in his writing career, maybe even before that 1602 Hamlet reference.
It's really fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It's like literary detective work trying to pinpoint exactly when this play was written. So we've talked about who and when. Now let's get to the what was Shakespeare's source material for this whole thing?
Well, the notes are pretty clear on this. They point to Sir Thomas North's translation of Plutarch's Lives, specifically the biographies of Julius Caesar, Marcus Brutus, and Marcus Antonius. That was Shakespeare's main historical source.
So he wasn't just making this up, he was drawing on some pretty established accounts.
Absolutely. And the notes also mention a specific edition of Plutarch, edited by a guy named Walter W. Skeet. They say his annotations and the way he selected the material are really useful for understanding how Shakespeare adapted these ancient stories for the stage. It's a good reminder that Shakespeare was working with existing narratives, even though he was filtering them through his own artistic lens.
Okay, so speaking of Shakespeare's lens, let's talk about how he portrays Caesar in the play. The notes call this not a little perplexing, which sounds like a polite way of saying something's a bit off.
A bit off is one way to put it. Apparently, the Caesar we meet in the play is quite different from the historical Caesar, and some of the speeches he gives don't match up with what we know from history.
That's interesting. So was Shakespeare just getting his facts wrong?
Not necessarily. The notes stress that Shakespeare definitely knew how important Caesar was historically. They even include these lines from the play that describe him as the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times, and someone with the deepest, most versatile, and most multitudinous head. So Shakespeare clearly understood Caesar's significance.
Okay, so if he knew all that, why portray him in such a strange light?
Well, the notes suggest a couple of possible reasons. One idea is that Shakespeare might have deliberately shown us Caesar through the eyes of the conspirators, how they saw him. This would have made Caesar look more like a kind of bogeyman, a threat to their idea of Rome.
So like a distorted view of Caesar almost.
Exactly. This choice could have been a way for Shakespeare to make the audience at least partially understand why the conspirators did what they did, even if their view of Caesar was flawed.
Right, like their motives, but not necessarily endorsing their actions.
Right. Another interpretation is that Shakespeare might have chosen to downplay Caesar's true strength until after he's assassinated. This would create a sense of irony, or what the notes call the irony of providence.
Yeah.
Like the old saying, pride comes before a fall.
So by not showing Caesar at his full power initially, his death becomes even more shocking, more tragic.
Precisely. It's like Shakespeare is subtly guiding our reactions, using the element of surprise.
That's really clever when you think about it. Okay, so we've got Caesar. Now let's talk about those two key players in the conspiracy, Brutus and Cassius. The notes point out that they had very different reasons for wanting Caesar dead.
Yes, very different indeed. Brutus, according to these 19th century notes, had a lot of respect for Caesar, even admiration. What bothered him wasn't Caesar's greatness, but his ambition, the threat he saw it posing to the Roman Republic. The idea that Brutus was acting out of personal grudges or jealousy. It's pretty much dismissed in this analysis.
And then there's Cassius, who's basically the opposite. The notes make it clear that his main motivation is envy. He resents Caesar's power, feels overshadowed and put down by him. There's even that line from Cassius where he says, This man is now become a god, and Cassius is a wretched creature and must bend his body. You can really hear the bitterness in that.
It's palpable, isn't it? And the notes find something really interesting in how the conspiracy plays out in the play. Remember, Caesar's assassination doesn't bring back the Republic. It just leads to more chaos, the rise of Antony, and ultimately the downfall of the conspirators themselves. This is seen as a powerful argument against the whole idea that killing Caesar was justified.
Like a cautionary tale about unintended consequences.
Exactly. The notes even quote Brutus when he says, "O Julius Caesar, thou art mighty yet. Thy spirit walks abroad and turns our swords in our own proper entrails." It's like Caesar becomes even more powerful in death.
Okay, so we've got Shakespeare's version of these characters, right? But how do they compare to the real historical figures of Caesar and Brutus?
Well, these 1883 notes offer some interesting historical insights, too. One historian they quote, a guy named Merivale, calls Julius Caesar the greatest name in history. He points to his brilliance as a general, a politician, and even a writer. He was a pretty remarkable guy all around. And the notes suggest that Shakespeare's depiction of Caesar, while interesting, doesn't really capture the full extent of his greatness.
So Shakespeare kind of toned down Caesar's awesomeness.
In a way, yes. And they give some historical context for Caesar's ambition, too. You see, from Caesar's point of view, the Roman Republic was falling apart, and he genuinely believed he was the one to fix it.
It's all about perspective, right?
It is. And the notes even quote another historian, Dr. Leonard Schmitz, who calls Caesar's assassination the most senseless act the Romans ever committed. He argues that it just led to more civil war and ultimately a weaker ruler in Augustus. So, historically speaking, killing Caesar was a pretty bad move.
Wow, strong words from Dr. Schmitz. Okay, so what about Brutus? How does the historical Brutus compare to the one Shakespeare gives us?
Well, according to the notes, there's a big difference there. Shakespeare paints Brutus as this super idealistic, noble guy. But the historical Brutus was much more complicated and maybe not quite as virtuous.
Oh, really? Fill me in on the historical Brutus.
Sure. The notes talk about his family connections, his stoic upbringing, his marriage to Portia, all that. But then they bring up some not so flattering stuff. They mention some shady dealings he was involved in, stuff we know about from Cicero's letters.
Like what?
Oh, like some questionable financial transactions with officials in Salamis, and some dealings with the king of Cappadocia that were, shall we say, morally ambiguous. And they even talk about Brutus's agent, Scaptius, who was apparently quite ruthless when it came to collecting debts, charging ridiculously high interest rates. So not quite the saintly figure we see in the play.
Yeah, it sounds like a much more human, flawed character.
Right. And the notes contrast Brutus's idealism with Cassius's more realistic, pragmatic view of the world. Cassius believed in the idea that the end justifies the means, whereas Brutus was much more principled, even if his principles ultimately led to his downfall.
It's interesting how the notes kind of analyze the play's characters on a psychological level, too.
They do. They even talk about how Brutus seems to feel genuinely remorseful after the assassination, while Cassius doesn't really seem to have any second thoughts.
So it's clear that Shakespeare took some liberties with the historical record, shaping these characters to fit the dramatic needs of his play. Speaking of the play itself, the notes also give an overall assessment of Julius Caesar as a work of drama.
Yes. And the general consensus seems to be that while the play has some absolutely brilliant scenes, it's not considered as structurally sound as some of Shakespeare's other plays, like Coriolanus. But it's still packed with powerful moments, no doubt about it.
And the notes point to some specific scenes that are particularly effective, like the one where Cassius manipulates Brutus in Act 1, Scene 2, and the depiction of the commoner's fickleness in Act 1, Scene 1. That scene with the cobbler with all the wordplay really shows Shakespeare's skill at entertaining a diverse audience.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the tension really ramps up in the scenes leading to Caesar's death, with Calpurnia's dream and the soothsayer's warning about the Ides of March. We get all these omens too, a lioness giving birth in the street, graves opening up, fiery warriors in the sky. It's really dramatic stuff. And the notes contrast Cassius, who interprets these as signs of weakness in the Roman people, with Cicero, who has a much more rational, less superstitious view.
It's like Shakespeare's playing with different ways of interpreting these supernatural events, right?
He is. And then, of course, we have Decius Brutus cleverly convincing Caesar to go to the Senate, Artemidorus trying to warn him with a written message, and the assassination itself with Caesar's famous line, "Et tu, Brute?" And right after the conspirators cry out, "Liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead." It's all very dramatic and emotionally charged.
And then comes Antony, whose arrival changes everything.
Oh, absolutely. His funeral oration is a masterpiece of rhetoric. The notes describe how he uses his emotions, how he reads Caesar's will to the crowd, pointing out how much Caesar cared for the common people, even leaving them money and access to his gardens. And then he shows them Caesar's wounds. This is the moment the tide really turns against the conspirators.
It's like Antony's playing the crowd like a master musician.
He is. And the notes then touch on the formation of the Second Triumvirate and their ruthless actions. Then we move on to the Battle of Philippi, with the contrasting personalities and military strategies of Brutus and Cassius.
And even in these final acts, the omens keep popping up.
They do. Cassius sees eagles, which were seen as good omens, being replaced by ravens and crows, which were symbols of bad luck. And then, of course, we have the tragic deaths of both Cassius, who misunderstands what he's seeing on the battlefield, and Brutus, who ends up falling on his own sword.
And the play ends with that surprising moment where Antony praises Brutus, calling him the noblest Roman of them all.
Yes. It's an interesting ending. Antony recognizes that Brutus, unlike the other conspirators, was driven by a sense of honor and a desire for the common good, even if he was tragically mistaken.
So, what are the big takeaways from all this? What's the aha moment for our listeners today?
Well, I think one of the main things we've seen is just how complex a seemingly straightforward historical event can be. Shakespeare wasn't just retelling history, he was interpreting it, shaping it, using it to explore these timeless themes of power, ambition, and the human condition.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, I think the takeaway here is that even the stories we think we know, especially when they're filtered through the lens of art, can have so many layers to unpack. Shakespeare wasn't just presenting facts, he was asking us to think critically about history, about motivation, about the choices people make.
This deep dive hopefully leaves you with some things to ponder. To what extent did Shakespeare change the historical facts, and why? What does the play tell us about Shakespeare's own time and the political concerns people had back then? And how do different interpretations of Caesar and Brutus, like the ones we've discussed, change how we understand the play's central conflict and its message?
At the end of the day, maybe the real brilliance of Julius Caesar isn't its historical accuracy, but its exploration of human nature. It forces us to look at the complexities of power, the seductive pull of ambition, and the choices we make in the face of difficult circumstances. It makes us question not just the events of the past, but also our own values, judgments, and the narratives we create to make sense of the world.
And who knows, maybe after listening to this, you'll see Julius Caesar in a whole new light.
Maybe you'll even be inspired to reread it with a fresh perspective.
I hope so. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time.
See you then.